So this is day 18 with our Pavlik Harness, and it has been a busy day for little Max today. He had his 12-week immunisations this morning, and then we had our hospital appointment this afternoon. His jabs weren't too bad, actually cried like normal. Logistically, it was a bit more challenging because usually when you take a baby to get vaccinations done, you hold them sort of facing in towards you on their side, and you sort of hold their legs together and sort of quite tight to stop them kicking out when sort of the needle goes in, and obviously I couldn't do that. So when I went in to the appointment, I sort of discussed with the nurse sort of how best we can hold him, and in the end we sort of agreed that just holding him on my hip was probably the best way to do it, and she sort of just pushed the rear suspension strap out the way to access the bit of the thigh that she needed to. But no, all fine, nothing sort of crazy with that. We then went to our appointment at the hospital, and the lady that we saw was great. It wasn't the same lady that we had the video call with, and it wasn't the lady that had seen us initially. But what she did do as soon as I went in was sort of say to me that she knows that I potentially hadn't been given lots of information, and that she knew I had lots of questions. So she spent a long time with me sort of going through everything and answering questions that I had about Max. I actually asked her some questions about Freddie as well, and that link that I've discussed before about DDH and hypermobility. And what she did sort of say is DDH is developmental dysplasia of the hip. So things can seem fine early on and then it can get worse. So actually with Freddie, even though he didn't have any sort of hip clicking or anything when he was like 1 day old when they do those checks, actually had he have been assessed again, or we'd had face-to-face appointments, which we didn't have because of corona, it may potentially have been picked up that he had a hip issue, which is why he's got the hypermobility now. So that was actually really interesting to talk to her about that. But we did look round Max's harness in the way that we'd adjusted it, and she did reassure me again that it did look sort of good, and he did look like he was in a good position still, and that the time that he'd spent like that wouldn't have sort of done any damage. I did speak to her about getting a scan, and she explained to me, and it does make sense, that with the grading that Max has, scanning too early is almost detrimental. So Max had, so when we first went for Max's appointment, he supposedly had a grade 2A on both sides. So the grading scale goes, if they're under 12 weeks, anything above 60 degrees is optimum, and that's fine. You then have 2A, which I think is between 50 and 60 degrees, and then it goes down, so 40 to 50, 30 to 40, and then sort of like fully dislocated or dislocated with the cartilage already starting to close with the hip outside. So when we first went, both Max's hips were in the 50 to 60 degree catchment, and one worse than the other, but I think the better side was only 3 degrees off, so I think it was 57 degrees. So that's why we were sent away and just coming back for checking, expecting it to be fine. And then when we went back, one hip still was in 50 to 60 degrees, but the other hip had then fallen into the 40 to 50 degrees catchment. And I asked sort of why that had happened and why I was expecting to be discharged. And what she said is in sort of general terms, and like 10 years of research that they've got, that trust in doing it the way that they do it now, is that only 2% of babies of Max's age that had a grading that he did would get worse, because as the children get older, the angle of the hip changes. So I think it's under 12 weeks they're looking for anything over 60 degrees, but if it's over 12 weeks then they're looking for a slightly different angle, because as you reach adulthood, I imagine it's 90 degrees that they're looking for with the hip. So he was actually very close initially, so that's why we were sent away, and then we came back, and unusually, you know, 2% unlucky for Max, his had got worse, so that's why we went into the harness. So that answered a lot of questions, and what she said was, if we scanned now, they don't usually expect to see any change in the hip that's visible on a scan for 4 to 5 weeks. So if we scanned now, we would potentially be sort of jumping the gun and thinking that nothing's happening. We would then be debating coming out of the harness and intervening with something else, and that was all way too soon, so we could be doing stuff that we don't need to. She said, had he have had like a grade 4, which is where like the hip's properly out or the cartilage is already over type of thing, then they would do weekly scanning, because that's like a whole different ball game with that grade. So from that side of it, it's quite positive. Sort of now I understand it. I know why they wouldn't do that, and the last thing I want to do is to sort of insist on treatment that we don't need, because I think there's a problem that there isn't. And she obviously understood my concern and everything, and she was sort of really empathetic, which was fine. We did fit a new harness, so we now have a medium-sized harness, which is nice. I got to give him a little bit of a wipe down and stuff like that. She done some physical just examination with him, just looking where his hips were lying, how much stretch he could get, and he had really poor abductor stretch when we initially got it fitted, so he basically couldn't drop his knees to the floor essentially, or like towards his back. And she said that looks like it's improved now, and he's got sort of a 70-degree angle on that. So he still needs to improve, and we need to get it down to 90 degrees, which is basically flat. But for 17, 18 days, she says that's like pretty good. It's all going in the right direction. And she did also say that in the last 10 years at that hospital trust, they haven't had to refer anybody on to a further hospital or for sort of surgery that had Max's grading level, which is like super, super positive. So feeling good about that. She did just say, you know, it could be 8 weeks and then a month sort of weaning off the harness. It could be 12 weeks and then a month weaning off the harness. So hopefully another like 2-3 weeks or so, we might have a better idea where he is at. When I asked about sort of taking his feet out to clean, she said the guidance is given not to remove the harness at all, especially early on, is because some people would just take advantage of that, and actually every minute that they're not in the harness isn't ideal. So she said we can take it off for like 30 seconds every day on the feet to like give them a clean and then strap them back up, because what you don't want them to do is start straightening their legs, and you want them to literally stay up as far as possible and as wide as possible, which again is like fine. So I am going back again on Thursday for our normal appointment. She did say I didn't have to go, but because I've sort of worked out Freddie's childcare around those 2 weekly checks, I'm just going to keep that and then go again in 2 weeks for the scan. So all pretty positive really. But yeah, it's I feel happier about it now. I feel like I've got more of the information, I understand it more, but still feel like there's still lots of uncertainty. She did say that first scan is quite daunting, and they obviously want to make sure that they're looking for the right thing. And then, as I said, I did speak to her a little bit about Freddie and sort of his hypermobility and sort of his walking stuff, and how I'd seen private physios, NHS physios for him. And she did say that if I did actually have any concerns about the way he was walking, then she'd be happy to like book him in for an x-ray if I wanted an x-ray for him. But she said it's unlikely that anything would be wrong, seeing as he's been assessed by so many people already. But she does think that he did have obviously a mild DDH, which has sort of just like corrected itself. But yeah, it's one of those things. She said Max will likely have hypermobility, and that most of the children that they see that have been harnessed do have some form of hypermobility, but they do check them at 18 months, 3 years and 5 years old. So he'll be sort of under some form of orthopedic care for several years to come. So again, that's all positive. But yeah, not too much of a bad day really, so I feel a bit more empowered just with the knowledge that I didn't have to start with. So all good from there. I do have a little bit of a grizzly baby on my hands just from the jabs, but we'll roll with that. It could be worse, but yeah, I'll check back in tomorrow if anything else has happened. But cool, catch you later.